All right, guys, so we just finished up a training that we conducted this morning, a 3.5-hour long training on exploring the grief of addiction and overdose death. And obviously, we can't cover everything that we covered today in the training, but we wanted to record a quick video on this topic just to share a really Reader's Digest version of some of the most important topics and themes that come up when we talk about this type of grief.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're just going to try to stick to some of the big points, but then at the end we'll give you some resources where you can go for some more information.
Sure. So actually, Lisa, if you don't mind me getting a little bit personal, this is a topic that is really important to you. It's sort of really near and dear to your heart for a lot of reasons. Do you mind sharing why?
Sure. No, I don't mind at all. So if any of you guys read What's Your Grief or listen to our podcast, you probably know that addiction has had a really significant impact on my family. So when my dad died when I was 18, after that, my sister really struggled with a long-term drug addiction. And within that also, her boyfriend, who is very much part of our family, lived with my family, died of a drug overdose. And that was sort of in the early days of the opioid epidemic, and there was not nearly as much conversation then around both just sort of the increase in opiate use in general, but also around grief and bereavement related to overdose losses. So it's something that just, for me, when I got into this work professionally, I had a real interest in thinking about more with that and more support that was needed, the support I felt like didn't exist at the time.
Right, and so from the very beginning of What's Your Grief, this has been a topic that you've been kind of writing about, talking about, really advocating for, and so you're sort of a little content expert on it. So I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions about this type of grief.
Sure.
And have you answer them.
Yes.
So the first thing is, we told you that the training was called Exploring the Grief of Addiction and Overdose Death, and so obviously working at What's Your Grief with people who have experienced many different types of deaths, we talk a lot about the death of a loved one from overdose, but what people don't always talk about as much a type of grief is the grief that's just related to grieving somebody who is experiencing an addiction, but who hasn't necessarily died. They're still alive and in your life, but there's a certain grief associated with the fact that you and them are going through this experience.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that people often don't think about is the idea that they can grieve someone who is still alive. And there's this concept called ambiguous grief, which it was put forward by Pauline Boss, and she was really kind of thinking about people in, especially you think of her with things like Alzheimer's and dementia, but where someone's sort of there but not there.
Right.
And in a not totally dissimilar way, substance use disorders really can create that experience where you feel like this person who you know and deeply love doesn't feel like the person that you know them to be. So when they're using drugs, they may be lying, stealing, they might not be thinking, behaving, talking as the person that you normally know them to be. And so over a period of time, when that sometimes starts to become more the norm of who they are, you feel like you've lost the person who they used to be when they were clean and sober. And there is a real grief that goes with that. You feel like you can't have maybe the type of relationship that you used to have before, or the type of the relationship that you normally would have. We had a good conversation about that today in the training. And you just feel a real sense of loss to the substance.
And I imagine with that, it's not just grieving the person who they used to be, but also the person and the relationship that you imagined you would have at this point in your life.
Exactly. And then for many people, it's that at different moments, you realize that they, because of their use, are not doing the things that maybe you expected that they would do. You thought that they would be going off to college now, or you thought that maybe they'd be settled in a job or a relationship or having kids, and those things aren't happening in the same way, maybe because of that substance use disorder. So there can be an ongoing sense of loss that happens.
Something that we talked about today that really speaks to me, because I think it's really common in grief in general, is that when you are experiencing this type of grief, a lot of the time you have to live with two realities, two truths, and oftentimes these things seem to be in contrast of one another. They seem to be in conflict. But when you're experiencing this type of grief, something that you have to learn to sort of integrate into your understanding is that two things that seem a little bit contradictory actually can exist at the same time.
Yeah.
The idea is that you have to make room for both of them to exist.
And that's challenging, I think, for people. I think we can be very black and white or all or nothing, and so we often think it's either one or the other.
Right.
But Pauline Boss talks about this idea of imagining, this person is both John and not John.
Right.
And how do we resolve that? Or how do we think about I am both maybe doubtful and hopeful at the same time. I can have these different feelings at the same time. I can both deeply love someone and be deeply angry with that person, and sort of getting comfortable with the duality of those emotions.
Definitely. So when we talk about grief, we're very careful to give the caveat that grief is so unique to the individual. No two people grieve in exactly the same way. But something that we do know is that when people experience similar types of losses, there are things that tend to be common themes, maybe shared experiences.
Yeah.
It's not a given that everybody will experience these same things, but we see them come up more in certain instances than with others. So with people who are grieving the death of a loved one from an overdose, what are some of those common themes, common experiences that we see coming up?
I think one of the big ones that comes to mind and that we hear talked about a lot is certainly that feeling of stigma and stigmatization that can come. And we've come a long way with talking about addiction and substance use, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people feel that other people blame their loved one for the addiction, or maybe blame them for their loved one's addiction, or that they sort of, that the way that their loved one died overshadows the person's life, or that their addiction overshadows the person who they were. That substance use disorder has now clouded the way that people saw or remembered them. And that feeling can also lead to what we kind of call disenfranchised grief, which is the feeling that our loss isn't as valid and isn't something that society sort of is socially sanctioned, or that society supports us or validates us in. So when that happens, people are more likely to do things like isolate, they feel shame, they feel less open about what the cause of death was, because they feel like they might be judged for it. So there's a lot that can go with that, and we find that people who are struggling with disenfranchised types of losses do have higher rates of then maybe having long-term issues with depression and other things that come up down the road.
Definitely. So this is obviously just a very little bit of what we would talk about in a training, or what somebody who is experiencing this type of grief would want to know. So we think we can't cover everything in a YouTube video. We know people only have so much time to be watching YouTube videos, and their attention spans are only so long if they're anything like us. So the most important thing I think here is to familiarize people with resources and what their next step might be to find more information and to find more support.
So, first of all, you can definitely go to our website, what'syourgrief.com. We have a ton of different articles. There's a lot of really common emotions that come with this that we don't have time to get into here. Things like guilt and shame and blame and relief and a whole lot of things that people feel, and we have posts on almost all of those topics, but we also have just a number of posts that are about overdose, grieving overdose losses and disenfranchised losses specifically. So that's one great place that you can start. But there's also good community resources if you're looking to connect with some other people who might be grieving overdose losses in your community. There's a great group called GRASP, which is a peer-run support group. So there's no mental health professional or grief professional running the group. It's run by volunteer peer support, but it's all people who are who have lost someone to a substance use disorder. So it's GRASP, Grief Recovery After Substance Passing, and you can find them online with a meeting locator. I will say they are not, they're still growing, and so depending on your community, you might not have a GRASP in your community. If you don't, I would encourage you, many communities do have Nar-Anon and Al-Anon chapters, and those are peer support groups for people whose loved ones have an active addiction, so someone who you have a family member with a substance use disorder. But many people who are involved in those groups will sometimes continue to go even after they've lost a loved one to substance abuse, use, or they may just also know some of the other resources going on in your community and being able to help you connect with other people who are family members of those who have a substance use disorder or who died of a substance use disorder. Beyond that, you can certainly go online and look in your community for other resources, either from hospices, things like that around this. And International Overdose Awareness Day, which happens to be the day we're recording this video, they do have a website as well that does have some resources. They're focused more on awareness than anything else, but they do have some other information on their website.
Today during the training, we talked a little bit about what happens when family members get a little bit of psychoeducation about what it means to experience addiction. A lot of times people don't fully understand the way addiction works, biologically, psychologically. And I think that this is something that, as you expressed today, exists kind of on a continuum where there can be a lot of benefit to getting that psychoeducation and learning more. But then there can be some sort of moments of pause. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because I think that one thing that unfortunately happens is sometimes after we lose someone to a drug overdose, we might get very involved in advocacy work, and we start to learn more about substance use disorders. And we start to see sort of, and again, there's no checklist of what helps or doesn't help. If there was, like, we would not be in the place we're in this country, right? But there are some things that can be sort of helpful and some things that are less helpful for families. And so sometimes learning that can actually make people aware that the way that they handled their loved one's substance use disorder might not have been the ideal way, or it might not have been the only way. If nothing else, sometimes we look back and
we do the best with the information we have.
Exactly.
But when we learn in hindsight, a lot of times we might wish we had done things differently.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that almost always when the outcome to something is not the outcome that we wanted, we will question what we did and how we handled it. But there are some things that can be tough when we actually learn more about substance use disorders, and we realize, you know, there's some regrets there about how we handled things, even when we were doing the best we could. So remembering we were doing the best that we could is important with the information we had. And then using the new knowledge we have to educate other people and to raise more awareness and to sort of let other people know what they can be doing can be a really important part.
And on the flip side, getting that information can sometimes be a relief to people, right?
Of course, absolutely. Because sometimes in learning that information, you understand a lot more about the fact that we can't control someone else's substance use disorder. As much as we want to be able to fix another person, we can't fix another person. And so sometimes a little more education about that helps people to understand that relationship between a person and their own recovery, and that there are truly limits to what any third party can do to help someone else.
Yeah. So, okay, well then I think that about covers all that we can cover. We will share some of those resources. We'll just put the links to them in the description below. But as always, we encourage you to, number one, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We do YouTube videos on all sorts of different topics. We're slowly growing our library, but we hope over time to have a lot and something for everybody. And then secondly, please, share your experience in the comments below if you're open to sharing something you say might help to support or give someone else hope, or if you're looking for a little bit of extra support, maybe somebody else can come along and help to provide that to you. So we're hoping that this can be sort of a What's Your Grief YouTube community, not What's Your Grief YouTube channel. So with that, thank you all, and we will be back soon with another video.
Yep.